From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums.
Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's story is the story of Talking Heads. From the 1960s through 2000s, most great bands built on what came before. The Beatles drew from Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Little Richard. Eagles leaned into the harmonies of the Beach Boys and Crosby, Stills and Nash. Nirvana fused a love for both the Beatles and Black Sabbath. But then there's Talking Heads. Not a refinement, not a revival, something entirely new. Three art school students leave Rhode Island for a crumbling New York City in the mid-'70s, a city on the brink of bankruptcy. They didn't chase a sound, they invented one. Nervous rhythms, angular guitars, lyrics that felt like overheard thoughts. Music that didn't just break rules, it ignored them completely. They emerged from a New York scene as others did, but quickly stood apart. Talking Heads were wired straight into something different. This is a story of a band that didn't follow the blueprint. They rewrote it. Our guest today to discuss Talking Heads is Johnathan Gould, the author of books on the Beatles, soul R&B artist Otis Redding, and his current book, Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock, which was recently released. Johnathan joins us today from New York City. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, Johnathan.
Thank you.
Johnathan, why did you choose Talking Heads as your subject?
Talking Heads was really the band that grabbed me for all sorts of reasons. I wasn't that much of a fan of the punk scene. I wasn't certainly that much of a fan of the progressive rock scene in the 1970s, but Talking Heads leapt out.
Your book's a real deep dive of a band that has been a bit of a mysterious creature all these years. Help us understand the characters that inhabit the band, their family backgrounds, and how they came together.
Sure. I suppose one characteristic of them is they all came from upper middle class families. David Byrne, less so than the others. David was born in Scotland. His parents immigrated first to Canada and then to the United States. His father worked for Westinghouse. He was a high-level electrical engineer who worked on defense contracting systems, submarines, guidance systems, things like that. David grew up in a town called Arbutus, which is a sort of working-class, blue-collar suburb of Baltimore. And David was a shy, rather awkward kid who nevertheless had his share of friends. And he, from an early age, spoke about attaching himself to people who were more outgoing as a way of compensating for his shyness, something that becomes very important. We today in the world speak confidently about something we call the spectrum, and we talk about people who have high-functioning autism. We've all become very familiar with that. Such a thing didn't exist in the 1950s or 60s or 70s when David was growing up. David has described himself as having what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, which is another word for high-functioning autism. He describes it as a mild case, and compared to some versions of autism, of course, it was a very mild case. He was quite functional in the world. He was shy, he was awkward, but it also gave him a pretty powerful sense of concentration, of focus, this sort of thing, which many people with high-functioning autism we now know have. He was an oddball who managed to fit in this kind of blue-collar suburban town outside of Baltimore. Now, the other two people in the band had very different backgrounds. Chris Franz was the son of a lawyer, a former military officer who became a lawyer in the Army, a West Point graduate. He grew up in a true upper middle class milieu in Pittsburgh. He went at one point to a boarding school called Christ Church, which was near Chesapeake Bay. And then he came home, and for his last 2 years of high school, he went to a school called Shadyside Academy, kind of like the top private school in Pittsburgh. While he was at Shadyside Academy, his interest in visual art was strong enough that he applied to the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD as it's called, and was accepted there, and that's where he went to college. David also applied to RISD. and was accepted at RISD. David, too, was drawn to art in high school. So the two of them entered college at the same time in Providence. They were on the same corridor in their dorm, but they were not friends their freshman year. Chris has described the way he took one look at David, who at that time had a thick beard and looked a bit like a hobo. Some people at RISD thought he might be Amish because there was something definitely unusual about his physical presentation. Anyway, Chris took one look at this guy and thought, I want nothing to do with him. Chris, in the meantime, was developing a very rock and roll look, well-groomed head of hair, and all of the sort of trappings of what we think of as late 60s, early 70s rock dress in that way. Mm-hmm. David had a rough time at RISD. RISD is a fairly conventional art school, and David was drawn to the one form of art that had nothing to do with any of that stuff. He was drawn to conceptual art, nothing to do with drawing. It had nothing to do with painting, nothing to do with sculpture. It was all about ideas. And after a year there, he dropped out. He really felt like a fish out of water. Not to try a different type of education, but try a different art school. So he enrolled at the Maryland Institute College of Design in Baltimore, close to his home, MICA, as that school is called. And David wound up dropping out. So he went to two art schools, dropped out of each of them after the end of his first year, and spent some time kind of hitchhiking around the country, this sort of thing. But a year later, a good friend of his that he knew from MICA had transferred to RISD, and David wound up going back to Providence and reacquainting himself with his cohort of acquaintances there. And that's when he and Chris Franz first got together. They had a mutual friend who had made a kind of underground film, and the friend asked Chris and asked David if they would do some music for the film, and that's where the two of them met. By that time, though, the third member of the original Talking Heads had come into the picture. Tina Weymouth grew up in a military family. Her father was a high-ranking naval officer. As a result, she lived all over the world, wherever her father was stationed. San Diego, Honolulu, Washington, D.C., Annapolis, Newport, and in Keflavik, which is a remote naval base in Iceland. Mm-hmm. Her father commanded the aircraft carrier that retrieved Alan Shepard, the first American space flight. So her father was, as I say, a high-ranking naval officer, an admiral. Her father was actually transferred to Vietnam, and the family spent the time that he was serving in Vietnam in Los Angeles. So Tina had, for her last 2 years of high school, a fairly conventional Los Angeles high school experience. She was on the cheerleading team. She went first to Barnard, which at that time was the girls' school of Columbia, and she was studying French. And then she decided to transfer to RISD. And so Chris and Tina met at RISD after David had left there. And by the time David returned, they were a couple. They'd gotten together. So that was the way these three people met. Chris and Tina graduated in 1974. And David found himself at loose ends.
Next, the three friends, David Byrne, Chris Franz, and Tina Weymouth, move to New York City and stumble on a new opportunity.
I'm Peter Aaron, author of Moving in Stereo, Rick Ocasek, The Driving Force of the Cars, and you're behind the wheel at the Garage to Stadium's Music History Podcast.
David Byrne wound up moving to New York City and lived on Bond Street in Lower Manhattan with another friend from the Rhode Island School of Design, who said, "Help me renovate and you can stay here." Chris Franz and Tina Weymouth moved to New York City a couple of months later. To understand the New York City the trio walked into, you have to rewind the clock. After World War II, Lower Manhattan roared with garment factories, warehouses, and light industry, packed into the buildings south of Houston Street. But by the late 1960s and early 70s, the machines had fallen silent, with these kinds of businesses moving to the suburbs or replaced by foreign imports. Jobs and companies disappeared. The result? An eroded tax base and a once roaring New York City teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. However, this led to abandoned lofts in Lower Manhattan suddenly becoming dirt cheap, creating the perfect breeding ground for a new generation of artists, punks, and outsiders who would ignite New York's alternative music scene And by 1975, the fastest growing demographic in New York was the 25 to 35 age segment.
David and Chris and Tina rented a loft on Christie Street in Lower Manhattan. They were all able to get standard entry-level jobs that paid minimum wage. They were each of them making a few $100s a month. Chris is a stock boy, Tina as a shop girl, David is a theater usher, those sorts of jobs. They could afford to rent this large loft in which, when everybody went home and the rest of the building went home at night, they could play rock and roll as loud as they wanted for as long as they wanted in that sense. And
then, of course, that leads us to the origins of where they got their first gigs, the infamous or famous CBGBs. And maybe you could tell the story of Hilly, the founder, and how this came to be.
Yeah, well, Hilly Crystal was started out thinking he might be a folk singer, might be an actor, something like that. But early on, he got into managing clubs. At one time, he was the manager of the Village Vanguard, which was the top jazz club in New York in those days. In the 1960s, he opened a series of bars, really. Clubs is dignifying it a little bit. One was called Hilly's, and I think it was on 9th Street, and it was 1969. He moved his operation to a place that he called Hilly's on the Bowery. Some listeners may remember the idea that the Bowery was once world famous as being the Skid Row of New York City. The expression Bowery bums or Bowery boys or this sort of thing. It was the poorest part of New York, essentially. The club was on the ground floor of something called the Palace Hotel, which was basically a flop house for indigent people, alcoholics. That's a good thing for a bar. They start drinking at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and they stay there until you close the place. For the first 4 years, he tried putting music in there. Sometimes he would put in jazz groups, sometimes some of the kind of early LGBT groups in New York City, this sort of thing. And then he decided he was going to change the name of the club. And he put up an awning that said CBGB. And CBGB stood for country, bluegrass, and blues. Nobody knew that. It was CBGB. A guitarist who lived in the neighborhood named Tom Verlaine, who had a band called Television, came up to him and asked if the band could play there. And Hilly said, sure. They would get the door, he would get the bar in terms of the finances of it. So Television was the first band that played there. Hilly said they were the worst band I ever heard in my life. One of those groups was the Ramones, who, unlike Television, didn't live in the neighborhood. They all lived in Forest Hills, Queens. When David Byrne first came to New York, this loft that I referred to on Bond Street is directly around the corner from CBGB. And by the way, the name of the club was CBGB. For some reason or another, people have always referred to it as CBGBs. They put an S on the end of it, which has a better ring to it, I think. When Chris and Tina arrived in the city, David took them there, showed them the place, and this became the focus of their idea about where they might play.
Next, guitarist and lead singer David Byrne and drummer Chris France know they need a bass player to complete their trio, and a surprising candidate is hired for the job.
Garage to Stadiums, ranked as one of the top 5% of podcasts globally.
When Chris reconnected with David, they talked about getting back together and forming a band in New York City. And to do that, they would need a bass player. David played guitar, Chris played drums. Tina, in the meantime, was planning on pursuing a career as a visual artist. So they wanted a loft where a band could rehearse and where Tina could paint. And after several weeks of not being able to find a bass player, either Chris suggested or Tina suggested, well, maybe Tina should play bass. She had played a little bit of acoustic guitar, but she had no musical experience. She'd never had much of a relationship with popular music. But Tina is a bright, dynamic, at that time, young woman who set her mind to doing this. David Byrne was basically her instructor as a bass player because he was the person who played a stringed instrument. And the three of them began rehearsing in their loft on Christie Street, near as I could tell, beginning in December 1974. And they continued to hang out at CBGB's. And then by June, they decided that they were ready to try playing in front of people. And so they asked Hilly Crystal if they could do that. And they came in and they auditioned for him. They passed the audition, and he put them on a bill with opening for the Ramones, who at that time had become sort of one of the top acts at CBGB's. June 6th, 1975 was their first gig ever, anywhere, as far as that goes.
What would we witness sitting in CBGB when the Talking Heads took the stage?
Well, there's some great descriptions of it because people saw them very early on and wrote about them. I would say the overwhelming impression of them had to do simply with their awkwardness. David particularly looked very awkward, very nervous, very withdrawn. Most performers do their best to command the room, command the stage, and act like they're the center of attention and that all eyes are on them. David and Talking Heads had none of that. But there was something fascinating about seeing somebody who looked that uncomfortable on stage, especially because there were other characteristics they had. They had been rehearsing sort of avidly for 6 months. There was an aspect of them that was very, very polished compared to many of the other bands at CBGB's that tended to get up on stage and just blast away in this sense.
The bands that were part of that core group, because we always kind of lump them in together. But reading your book, there wasn't much camaraderie among the groups.
No, it wasn't that kind of a scene. There was no sort of mutual admiration for the most part going on. The Ramones were not exactly what you would call likable. They thought they were better than everybody else because they thought that everybody else who were writing songs that 2 or 3 chords to them were a bunch of pretentious Manhattanites. Blondie, on the other hand, was a nascent pop group, and their main task was to figure out what sort of words to put in the mouth of this beautiful girl who stood in front of them, and so on and so forth. Television, on the other hand, were very impressed with themselves. 2 quite accomplished guitarists in the group. They thought of themselves almost in the line of bands like the Grateful Dead or the Allman Brothers, these 2 guitar bands that improvised on stage and so on and so forth. The original CBGB's bands were in competition with one another, and none of whom were particularly supportive of one another. Probably the person who had the greatest success starting at CBGB's was Patti Smith, who was a mesmerizing performer, not a great singer. Patti Smith was a riveting performer who very quickly got a recording contract with Columbia Records. But Patti Smith's great line to Talking Heads when I think it was Chris Franz introduced himself to her at CBGB's one night. Patty turned to him and basically said, "Oh," she said, "you're that art school band." She said, "I wish my parents were rich enough to send me to art school," and just turned away, and that was the end of the conversation, right? So it gives you some sense of how they were perceived.
Next, Talking Heads get their big break via a curious young journalist who writes a seminal article on this innovative New York music scene.
Garage to Stadiums, ranked as one of the top 5% of podcasts globally.
By the summer of 1975, there was a scene developing around CBGB's. The Ramones, Patti Smith and the Ramones, opening acts basically had to invite all their friends so that they'd be people sitting there. But by that summer, things were starting to happen. And a sort of cub reporter for the Village Voice named Jim Walcott started to write about the people who were performing at the club in the Village Voice. And Hilly Crystal had this idea in August of 1975 that he would put together a sort of a festival of CBGB's bands, downtown bands. And Jim Walcott wrote a long piece in the Village Voice about the bands that appeared at this festival. And there was a write-up of television, and there was a write-up of Talking Heads, and there was a write-up of the Ramones. But the critical element when the article came out in the paper, the group that they chose to picture in a photograph on the front page of the Village Voice was Talking Heads. This had to do somewhat with the idea that they were kind of photogenic. What made them photogenic? They were pretty attractive people. Not wildly so, but attractive enough as far as this goes. And the Voice was a big deal in those days, the organ of the arts in downtown New York. That article attracted the attention of John Rockwell, the official rock critic of the New York Times. After Walcott's article came out, Rockwell wrote a piece about Talking Heads. What this means is that basically 7 months after Tina Weymouth first picked up a bass and tried to learn how to play it, is being written up in the New York Times. Um, this is the sort of publicity that most people wait years for in that sense. But Rockwell, like Walcott, like many music writers who were living in New York City at that time, was fascinated by the idea that some kind of a local generic music scene seemed to be happening in Lower Manhattan. The New York writers who had access to major media wrote about it as if it was a major musical phenomenon.
The three Talking Heads members realized they needed to round their sound and went knocking on the door of a band they admired from Boston. And they tried to recruit what sounds like an unlikely candidate, a graduate student from Harvard.
Kick back, relax, and enjoy your trip from the garage to global stadiums.
One important development before the first album. They knew from the very beginning that the three-piece configuration was pretty unworkable for them. If you think back, most of the successful three-piece bands, that is, say, bands with three instruments, whether they have an added singer or not, they've had virtuoso musicians in them. They've had guitarists like Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix. They've had drummers like Mitch Mitchell or John Bonham or people like that. They had virtuoso players. It's very hard for three people to put music across in an effective way. They knew they needed a fourth member. They figured he should probably be a keyboard player, although it would certainly be helpful if he or she could also double on guitar. And in the year before they recorded their first album, they managed to connect with Jerry Harrison, whose background was in keeping with theirs. He grew up in an upper middle class family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a suburb of Milwaukee. He went to Harvard University, from which he graduated. But Jerry had also played in a band which in many ways was a kind of premonition of Talking Heads called the Modern Lovers, who were a cult band that made some interesting recordings, but then fell apart. Were led by a figure,
Johnathan Richmond. Yeah.
Johnathan Richmond, who in many ways was a kind of premonition of David Byrne, a real oddball who professed to love the suburbs around Boston, where he grew up. So Jerry Harrison fit with Talking Heads very well. And as I say, joined the band very shortly before they made their first album.
Talking Heads 77 is their first album with Sire Records. And of course, it has the infamous Psycho Killer. Don't worry about the government, tentative decisions. Tell us about the themes that they're exploring in that first album.
In the beginning, occasionally David and Chris Franz would write together. Chris would have a set of lyrics that David would use. But quite quickly, David basically announced to the rest of the other members of the band that he really felt he needed to write the words and the music to the songs. And this became actually the pattern of their entire career. There were forms of instrumental collaboration that took place, words or melodies of the songs in that way.
I was listening to Chris Franz, an interview I saw online, and he was saying that when they first met, a family member knew a lawyer they should run the contract by. They got a schooling in how royalties are split. And Byrne sort of announced after that, I'm not going to be singing anything that I don't write from here on in.
Since I wrote the book, I've heard Chris say that. Unsurprisingly, later on, there was a great deal of tension in the band around the question of royalties. This has been true of almost every rock band, every major rock band that has ever existed in that way. So the songs on the first album were mainly with the exception of Psycho Killer, were mainly the most recent songs that they'd written. There are songs on the record that address romantic situations, all of them from a sort of negative point of view. Basically, the message of most of these songs is we don't need love. Since love is the common denominator of popular music and has been for about 150 years, it's very interesting to think about this band, which is sort of interrogating the very idea or need for romantic attachment as one of their basic themes as they come into the world in that way.
Next, the band befriends a mercurial figure in the music industry and believes he might be the key to evolve their sound.
Enjoying Garage to Stadiums? Check us out on your favorite socials: Instagram, YouTube, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
When the Talking Heads toured London after their debut album, they met producer Brian Eno, formerly of Roxy Music. After leaving the band due to creative differences, Eno pioneered ambient music, a style focused on tone, texture, and atmosphere rather than traditional melody, designed as much to shape a space as to command attention. Think of the kind of music you hear in a boutique hotel lobby or an airport at 2 a.m., more atmosphere than performance. That approach would go on to deeply influence his collaborations with David Bowie, especially the Berlin-era albums like Bowie's Low. Impressed by what Eno had achieved with Bowie and his reputation as a boundary-pushing thinker, Talking Heads pushed to bring him in to produce their next album, More Songs About Buildings and Food, launching a collaboration that would reshape their sound.
From the very beginning, helped them to reimagine both their sound and their whole approach to record making. Whereas on the first album, they had tried to get the sound of the band live on their first album. This is who we are. This is what we sound like. We want it authentic. On the second album, by contrast, almost every sound on the record, every instrument, every vocal is manipulated in some way. Technique that Eno was learning as a producer, which was to use the opportunity presented by multi-track recording, where each instrument is isolated on a particular track, to tweak, or in some cases more than tweak, the sound or tone of every element of the music. David Byrne, I mentioned before, has enormous powers of concentration that may be related to his Asperger's. Has enormous powers of concentration that don't have anything to do with Asperger's. And so the two of them, as I say, were able to sort of focus in the recording process. And the result is a much more interesting, more imaginative record, despite the fact that the songs on it are probably not as strong as the songs on the first record, as far as that goes.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the covers, Take Me to the River, was, of course, Al Green.
Give especially Chris Franz some credit. Chris, from his high school years, was infatuated with soul music. He loved Al Green. He loved Otis Redding. When they recorded it, Eno suggested that they slow the tempo down drastically from the way they had played it, that the way to develop rhythmic force is not to speed things up, but often to slow things down, and not to complicate things, but often to simplify things. Eno educated them in a new level of instrumental, particularly competence. And it also had a big effect on David's singing, because when there's more space, when the tempos are slower, singers have to think harder about what they're doing. The whole experience of making that record for them, I think, oriented them toward music making in general in a new and very interesting way.
Produced by Brian Eno, that second album, More Songs About Buildings and Food, peaked at number 29 on the Billboard album chart. It was ranked at number 4 among the top albums of the year for 1978 by Britain's New Musical Express. Produced by Brian Eno, 1979's Fear of Music album by Talking Heads blend experimental rhythms with anxious urban themes on songs about an underground guerrilla moving through New York called Life During Wartime, and other tracks including Cities and Heaven, which were later covered by K.D. Lang and by the group Simply Red. Interestingly, much of the album was recorded in Chris Franz's and Tina Weymouth's Long Island loft, with cables running from a mobile studio truck parked outside.
The next album, Fear of Music, that rather than coming with written lyrics, it was more like, let's get the music and the vibe down, and then we'll worry about lyrics later.
It was something that actually started on Fear of Music, a track called I Zimbra. Both Eno and Byrne became deeply impressed with the Afro-pop music that was starting to come to Western ears, so to speak, in the late 1970s. And I'm talking about records by Nigerian artists like Fela and King Sunny Ade, African popular music that reflected the ancient tradition of African drumming, but translated to Western instruments. And Izimro was really the first evidence of it in Talking Heads repertoire. So Eno suggested that they use a nonsense poem from the Dada period, from the World War I period, when European intellectuals developed a similar sort of fascination with what they thought of as the exoticism of Africa. They are very much sort of like added on, as opposed to the way that most songs are written, which is that someone starts with a line and puts it to a melody and develops it in that way.
And that was really marked a turning point for the band, where this idea of more sounds, more things happening on a record really took place.
Having learned to simplify their sound, they could then start anew to making it more complex, to adding more tracks. On the next few albums, they began building things up again. And some of that had to do with their own proficiency. By the time of Fear of Music, which is 1979, they're a very proficient band, even to the point that David Byrne, even live, is starting to sing on key.
Next, the band tensions cause several band members to act on pursuing their own projects.
Enjoying Garage to Stadiums? Check us out on your favorite socials: Instagram, YouTube, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
During that period of time, the tensions started to rise because during an interview, apparently, David Byrne had told another reporter that he was thinking of leaving the band. Tina Weymouth and the others are kind of miffed at that. But of course, Eno's influence, Eno, how shall I say this? Eno had an affinity for David Byrne, so much so that they collaborated on that album, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. And that album's very innovative, sampled vocals, found sounds, African rhythms, Middle Eastern electronic music techniques, was recorded before Eno and Byrne's work on the next album, Remain in Light, adding another point of tension to this group in its nascent days.
Sure. The personal relations in the band were complicated from the beginning. There's no other way to put it. I don't know what would have happened if Talking Heads had not gotten the amount of publicity so soon that they did. That, of course, made them a going concern. And that meant that everybody in the band had to do their best to get along with one another as best they could. I don't think that Tina ever had a strong affection for David Byrne. And I don't know how much affection David Byrne ever had for any of the other people in the group. The sort of emotion that leads to feelings of loyalty and supportiveness and all of that sort of thing.
Johnathan, that's probably a function of what you said earlier. You would be assessed today as Asperger's.
Yeah. I mean, people with high-functioning autism struggle with concepts like empathy more than the rest of us, who also struggle with those concepts. And I think the fact that the others had no awareness that something like Asperger's exists, his behaviors could make them much less sympathetic to some of the quirks of his behavior. There are descriptions early on in the British music press of Tina Weymouth. One writer wrote, scolding David as if he was a sort of misbehaving child. In that way.
Yeah, I recall reading that in your book.
Early on, Chris and Tina, they thought that Eno's forceful personality would serve as something of a check on David's forceful personality. What they didn't bargain for was the idea that these two forceful personalities might get together with one another and amplify one another rather than check one another in some way. And the irony being that Eno and David bonded so powerfully in the making of that record, Fear of Music, that the other members of the group felt shunted aside in some ways.
And here is Byrne with Eno. And then you have Chris France and Tina Weymouth basically saying, man, we're feeling a little controlled in this environment. We've got to step out and do our own thing. And of course, that leads to the Tom Tom Club. She even hires her sisters, Laura and Lanny, are backup singers and eventual contributors to some songs. And that was a funky pop sound that they reached the top 40 with their efforts in June 81 with the first of their albums.
Well, absolutely. And particularly the hit song, Genius of Love. One of the great, I use this term advisedly, novelty records of, well, certainly the 1980s. It's a record that has this instrumental hook that, once you've heard it, you can't get out of your head. And it became more commercially successful than anything that Talking Heads had done. What it wasn't, though, was the start of a parallel career in any meaningful sense.
Working again with producer Brian Eno, Talking Heads released their 1980 album Remain in Light, featuring songs like Once in a Lifetime, Cross-Eyed and Painless, Houses in Motion, and Listening to the Wind. Blending funk, jazz, and African rhythms, the groundbreaking album is widely considered one of the greatest ever made, landing at number 39 in Rolling Stone magazine's top 500 albums of all time.
After Remain in Light, Jerry Harrison and David Byrne, who had been most involved with mixing the album and putting it in its final state, were acutely aware of the fact that there was no way that Talking Heads could reproduce this music live as a four-piece band. And so they decided, Jerry Harrison really took the lead in this, for the purposes of live performance, to expand the band. And they hired 5 more musicians. So all of a sudden, this 4 sort of preppy-ish looking band is performing on stage with 4 virtuoso black musicians, 1 additional, as I say, white virtuoso. It completely changed the band, the personal dynamic of the band. All of a sudden, they were touring as a 9-piece band. Touring does create a sense of camaraderie, interconnection between people in this way.
It would also dissipate the concentration of David among a higher amount of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The 2 things, it diluted David's presence a little bit, but it also freed David in ways that were really quite, as a performer.
It freed him from playing an instrument, for one example.
Exactly. And he loved singing with another really accomplished singer, which Gillette McDonald certainly was. The other people in the group, Adrian Ballou and Jerry Harrison, sang backup. Tina Weymouth also. So all of a sudden, there are different voices in the music.
The band capitalizes on its large band format of touring musicians to use the same approach on the recording of their next studio album, 1983's Speaking in Tongues, which would attract a new mass audience to the band and contain tracks like Burning Down the House, This Must Be the Place, and Slippery People.
So Speaking in Tongues was really the conversion of that live band to a studio album, right? The band was created to reproduce the complexity of Remain in Light, but now that complexity and that interplay particularly became something that they were able to translate onto record in Speaking in Tongues. The other great sort of virtue of Speaking in Tongues, the song on it, I took the title of the song for the title of my book called Burning Down the House. Mm-hmm. It's an incredibly powerful track, and it finally gave them a real hit single. And so on many different levels, Speaking in Tongues was the culmination of this kind of this whole musical progression that had been going on really since Eno first became involved with the band. Eno was not involved with Speaking in Tongues. They didn't feel they needed him at that point. They had learned how to make records like that.
The album reached number 15 on the Billboard album charts. And then as they get into the 80s, Byrne is really expanding. He's started to become the Renaissance man of rock. He composes music and lyrics for an opera.
One of the most interesting things, he worked with the great choreographer Twyla Tharp, and actually had an affair with Twyla Tharp on a dance piece called The Catherine Wheel. He got wonderful reviews, while the reviews of the dance piece itself were mixed. All of a sudden, Byrne is having the type of experience that a successful artist in New York City has, which is the phone ringing off the hook. Will you do this? Will you do that? Will you contribute a piece of visual art to an auction? He is eventually lionized on the cover of Time magazine, which in those days was a really big deal, as rock's Renaissance man.
He even writes music. He's commissioned to write some of the music for the movie, The Last Emperor.
Yeah.
Which ended up winning an Academy Award for Best Score.
There's a period there where it's as if everything he touches turns to gold.
The 1985 album Little Creatures, the 6th album by Talking Heads, delivered a more Americana tinge sound with steel guitar textures on hits like And She Was. Stay Up Late. It became the band's best-selling studio album with over 2 million U.S. copies and was voted Album of the Year in the Village Voice poll. The 1986 True Stories album incorporates country music and continues the use of Americana stylings begun on 1985's Little Creatures album in the form of accordions and fiddles. A popular single, Wild Wild Life, became the most prominent hit from the album, and the song's video won 2 MTV Video Music Awards in 1987.
And that leads us to True Stories, which was a quirky, he commissioned people to write a script, and then he took it over, changed it a lot. Ultimately, that became a movie and an album that the Talking Heads reproduced the soundtrack that David had developed. They actually put out an album, True Stories.
Yes, Americana, True Stories album and the album called Little Creatures were basically recorded at the same time. The songs for True Stories were songs that David had written for this film that was produced by Talking Heads' manager. David directed the film. Little Creatures and True Stories was a complete sea change from what they had been doing with the live band, with the big band, with the expanded heads, playing largely improvised instrumental grooves onto which he grafted increasingly sort of disassociated lyrics. He decided that he wanted to go back to writing pop songs that had conventional verses and choruses, lasted for 3 or 4 minutes and this sort of thing. And here again, the rest of the group was a little taken aback about this. They had been at the beginning when David pretty much sketched out the songs himself. But on Remain in Light and Speaking in Tongues, they had developed this way of writing, working off these instrumental grooves. And now all of a sudden, David is saying, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to present you with completed songs and you can add your parts to them in there.
Yeah.
Now, as it happened, Little Creatures was wildly successful. And the songs on it are terrific. But it created a whole new set of tensions in the band, who now again felt that he was dominating the music. And really, between his sort of blossoming as a film director, as a film composer, a dance composer, that really was the kind of final straw in the personal relations of this group. Mm-hmm. And it made him think that basically there are all these other things that I want to do with my life. And the idea of being one of David's many projects became sort of intolerable for the other members of the band.
We talked about how the stream of consciousness lyrics that David was well known for almost from the beginning of the band. And then, of course, he goes to the more traditional with Little Creatures, etc., pop structure. Do you think David's stream of consciousness became a bit of a crutch rather than writing more straight ahead lyrics? In other words, did he rely on it as a ploy to avoid the hard work of stringing together actual lyrics? Because here's why I say that. It was lauded by the fashionistas in the musical press as he's so smart, isn't this interesting? But was that a New York kind of like art thing? Whereas, hey, people who were putting together conscious lyrics are just as valid. Did it become a crutch? Did he rely on it too much? Was it the easy way out to sort of just blab a bunch of things?
I think it started as a fascination, but I think you're correct. I think it did become something of a crutch. He said he felt it was successful about half the time. Okay? And that's interesting right there. The idea that he was comfortable with using a technique that he felt was successful about half the time. Now, most Talking Heads fans would probably say that they felt it was successful much more than half the time. But I know exactly what you're saying.
When I think of lead singers who came after Byrne, who are lyric writers that rely on that same stream of consciousness, Michael Stipe of REM, Anthony Kiedis, the Red Hot Chili Peppers come to mind. Who do you think Byrne influenced with this stream of consciousness approach?
Well, I think you're naming them, but I think he's the most distinctive version. I think that poets particularly would say disassociation in one's writing requires greater discipline, not less discipline than otherwise in that way.
This tension ultimately ends in the culmination of the band. David decides that he wants to leave. Who do you think they've influenced since they have laid down their tracks, literally?
Well, you mentioned some of them, REM, Radiohead, Vampire Weekend.
If you were to tell
Yeah.
the history of music, what would you say about Talking Heads in the context of the history of music?
I would say that they took to use a sort of old-fashioned term, cosmopolitanism of popular music to an entirely new level. I think the most important thing involved their engagement with African music and what's now referred to as world music in general. Other thing that I would say about them, that almost every really important rock group had some element of virtuosity attached to it. There was no element of virtuosity attached to Talking Heads. And there's an important lesson there, almost a common denominator of whatever rock and roll continues to be.
The guest we've been talking to today is Johnathan Gould. He is the author of Burning Down the House, Talking Heads in the New York Scene That Transformed Rock, which was recently released. And Johnathan, you've taken us on a journey with the book and this interview today that is pointed to a band that continually innovated, continually pushed the envelope, and all sorts of different sounds over time in an original way.
Thank you. It's been fun talking about this.
Special thanks to our guest, Johnathan Gould, author of Burning Down the House, Talking Heads and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock. For more on today's episode, visit garagetostadiums.com, where you'll find bonus content on Talking Heads, including our thesis that they helped invent a new operating system for rock music, along with curated performance clips and song examples. You'll also find dedicated Talking Heads playlists, as well as additional curated downloadable playlists for every artist featured on the show. You can also find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky for daily music history insights delivered straight to your feed. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube to stay up to date on new episodes. Thanks to our production crew, Scott Campbell, Chad Raymond, Amelia Marianne, and Nigel Campbell. I'm Dave Anthony. Thanks for listening. Join us next time for another Garage to Stadium story.
Another Blast Furnace Labs production.